Hello everyone, welcome back for another video. In this one we're going to check out security governance, which sounds really fun and exciting, except not really. We're going to be looking at the boring side of cybersecurity, which is paperwork and documentation. Now if you're new to the series, drop a like, drop a sub, and maybe bookmark this playlist so that you can find the future videos I release. Now let's get into the first section. Policies, procedures, and standards. I did warn you, it's going to be a bit of a boring section. But it's important if you're preparing for things like the Security Plus exam. So let's get into it. First up, let's address policies. Policies are in a workplace what laws are in a country. I know it sounds a bit extreme, but it's probably the best analogy you can think of. Policies are going to do stuff like governing our operations. They're going to outline requirements for compliance, especially if the reason for your policy is to implement some sort of legal or regulatory compliance requirements that are imposed upon your organization. And most importantly, policies will outline repercussions for non-compliance. Now, usually our policies are going to come from several locations, or at least be inspired by several locations, such as frameworks, best practices, and industry regulations. Now moving along, let's have a look at some common policies. Please note these policies are not exhaustive. And first on the list is acceptable use policies. An acceptable use policy usually governs what is considered acceptable and unacceptable usage of the organization's computing resources. And I do suggest that the policy uses the wording resource, because I promise you, you're going to have somebody that will find loopholes in the policy. And when you talk about equipment or assets, it's arguable that we're talking about physical, tangible things. And the loophole finding employee will often look for things like services and virtual machines and stuff like that. But if you say resources, somebody using the network for something malicious or just unauthorized, or somebody running something in a VM that they created in their own time on their own equipment and then just transplanted to your systems at the workplace, can't argue that the policy doesn't apply to that. The acceptable use policy should also outline examples of unacceptable usage and be very clear on the repercussions. Another important thing as well is reporting structure for acceptable use policy violations. How do you report such behavior? And it's not as easy as you think, because you might say, well, let's go for an anonymous reporting system. But the problem with anonymous reporting systems is some people might use that as a way to be petty and mess with their professional competitors, shall we say. So what do you do then? Well, okay, make it normal and not anonymous. So what do you do then? Make it normal and not anonymous? You could do that, but then people are going to be fearful about reprisal if they report somebody for unacceptable usage of company computing resources. Also, you need a method to report in case the person violating it is the person you're reporting it to. This is a challenging policy to deal with and often does need to be regularly reviewed and updated. Then, your information security policy, a very broad policy that deals with general cybersecurity requirements and protection of data assets. This one is probably going to be inspired by both legal requirements as well as best practices, and should be fairly all-encompassing when it comes to protecting the network, the data, the systems, the services, preventative controls, detective controls, corrective controls. You get the idea. It's an umbrella policy. Another very important policy to develop is the continuity of operations policy, or the COOP policy. Now, this used to be called the BCDR policy, or Business Continuity Disaster Recovery, but a lot of organizations have moved towards making it a separate idea and making it called continuity of operations. The idea is, how would we keep organization operations going normally in a variety of disaster events? What are the critical services that matter the most? What should be done? What is necessary for the organization to survive a disaster event? And then separately, a disaster recovery policy that outlines how disaster recovery will be done. What's a pretty cool improvement in recent years with disaster recovery policy is the idea of a work recovery stage, where a disaster happens today and we implement continuity of operations, obviously. But then for disaster recovery, we recover just enough of the environment for today. And then maybe after hours, we recover tomorrow's resources and systems and data. And then we recover next week, and then we recover for the month. And then once we've bought ourselves some time, we can recover the environment fully later on. So the idea is a staggered recovery process where you're recovering and restoring stuff enough for the next period of time. Very, very cool idea, actually. Then another useful security policy would be the incident response policy. The incident response policy is going to dictate that incident response is a thing. It's going to dictate how it's going to be organized, how it's going to be structured, and what the requirements for compliance will be. This often is a best practice and regulatory requirement driven policy. But we had a whole section on incident response already, so I'm not going to bore you to death with that. Now, if you are developing software internally, a software development lifecycle policy is necessary as well, that will govern what is expected out of a development lifecycle strategy, what should be done, what requirements should be met, which requirements are non-essential. It basically just helps the developers and the project managers properly assess a software development management strategy and ensure that no matter what process is being followed, what framework model, etc., that cybersecurity requirements are being met and being met appropriately. Not just a box ticking exercise, but as an effective improvement in software security. Another useful thing as well is to have a policy that mandates change management or change control, which we're going to have a whole section on later on. But this is, as frustrating to follow, very, very useful in the workplace to ensure consistency and stability. Now, before we move on to the next section, I would like to just make a few useful suggestions. And the first one is that policies are living documents. They need to be updated and evolve with the times. There's going to be changes in technology and trends and various factors that's going to require a policy to be updated and improved so that it is relevant, it is enforceable, and it makes sense. As an example, I remember when social media first started becoming a thing, when MySpace and Facebook and stuff like that was popping up. Yes, I'm showing my age. But a lot of workplaces took the hardline approach of outright banning social media. And the problem with that strategy is there are some uses to social media in the workplace. And many workplaces now do allow social media usage to some capacity. Policies need to obviously be updated so that people using social media, like for instance the marketing team, are not going to be in trouble for literally doing their jobs. The next piece of advice as well is policies should not be complex to read. Keep them straightforward, keep them simple, and if you can, keep them as short and comprehensive as possible without sacrificing on the details, obviously. A policy document that is 50 pages long is not a pleasant read. If you could get it down to 5 or 10 pages, you're going to have more people reading it, more people understanding it, and people being more compliant with it, which is the purpose of the policy. Compliance, not confusion. Now, when confusion does arise, this is when guidelines become very, very useful. Guidelines are meant to be a set of recommendations for a scenario or a situation. And the idea of a guideline is to direct the actions that we will follow and take along a particular pathway. The idea is that guidelines are meant to be more flexible than a policy and, most useful, should help you in situations when the policy is not applicable. Now, the whole idea of the guidelines is going to say these are the overall principles that the policy is trying to enforce. And in a situation where the policy is not suitable or not a very, very good fit or just not really relevant, the guidelines help quite a bit. One of the other nice things about the guidelines as well is they can be very helpful when it comes to us reviewing and improving a policy and updating it, because we can refer to the guidelines and see, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve, these are the overall principles. Do our improvements to the policy, do our updates to the policy align with these things? It'll make our lives a lot more pleasant and a lot easier to work with. Then we move on to procedural documents. Now, the idea of a procedural document is it's going to give us step-by-step instructions on how to implement work in a way that is compliant with a policy. This might sound frustrating and annoying, but it does do quite a few useful things for us. It'll help us provide repeatable workflows that are consistent and predictable. The benefit of this is when it comes to cybersecurity, when something is consistent, when something is predictable, it makes our life a lot easier. So if we know that, let's say, the junior desktop support technicians are troubleshooting in a particular way, they're following a standard operating procedure, we know, okay, cool, these are the things they would have done to address this issue. And knowing that makes it a lot easier for somebody else to take over or ensure that the environment is behaving in a way that is expected and desirable, and thus easier to implement cybersecurity improvements. Now, usually the procedural documents will be related to a policy, and I highly suggest that the clear indication is done. Cross-reference the policy with the procedure document and vice versa, so that we know, okay, cool, this procedure helps us implement this policy compliantly. This policy requires us to follow this procedure to be compliant. It makes life a lot easier when they cross-reference one another. And it takes a lot of the thinking and hunting out of the equation. People will be able to look at the policy and go, okay, cool, but how do I be compliant? And they can find the relevant procedural document, and vice versa. Now, when one is updated, I normally suggest that you review the other. So for instance, if we update the policy, review the procedure to see if any changes need to be made. And vice versa, if we're going to change a procedure, review the policy to ensure that the change in the procedure is still compliant, or maybe the change in procedure does warrant an improvement, update, or renewal of an existing policy. Now, some common procedures, and please be aware this is not every possible procedure you could have. You should be looking at these though. They can be very, very beneficial in terms of improving your overall operations and security for them. First up is onboarding and offboarding of staff. This is normally a very useful thing, especially during the onboarding phase, as a lot of attackers might try and find a relatively menial job at a target organization to gain physical access. There have been a number of situations and events that have occurred in the past where attackers have gotten jobs as cleaning staff, janitors, whatever the preferred term is, at a workplace, and that gives them relatively universal access and also after hours access in a lot of cases. And you know what, even if it's not after hours access, a lot of people look at a janitor or a cleaner or whatever the preferred job title is, and they don't think of that person as a cybersecurity threat, because what's the person with a mop and bucket going to do to the environment? Well, you'd be surprised. They can tamper with stuff, they can plant rogue hardware. There's a lot of nasty stuff they can do. Then with the offboarding, this is also very useful. When an employee is leaving the workplace, no matter the circumstances, whether they've resigned, whether they're being retrenched, whether they have been dismissed or fired, whether they are retiring, whether they died, we want to make sure that the account that that employee has is handled carefully so that we can minimize on any risk that departing employee may have. Even if the person seems polite and cordial, you know what? You can have very, very good actors. People behaving polite and cordially and then planning to burn the bridges on the way out. Not a good situation. So must be very, very mindful that your departing staff can be just as dangerous, if not more so, than the new staff coming in. Moving along, background checks, which kind of implies and ties to the onboarding process. But background checks procedures should also be done on existing staff as well. And not just, when they're new or we haven't done a proper onboarding process yet, but regularly. You want to know if your staff members have been involved in any criminal activities, or maybe have recently become board members or directors in competing organizations. This kind of insight can be very useful to identify malicious insiders and possibly even situations for industrial espionage. So regular background checks would not be a bad idea. Also, your initial background check done for an onboarding process might not have been as thorough and deep as one that you could do once the person is employed, as you've got plenty of time to do it properly. Then, service and software provisioning. This procedure should be defined for whenever an organization is looking at procuring new services or new software utilities. The idea is to ensure that we're getting a new product that is going to benefit the workplace and not jeopardize our operations, our security, and our profitability. And most importantly, ensure that there's no fraudulent procurement either, where the person recommending vendor B happens to have a vested interest in vendor B, whether they own shares, whether they're a member of the board, or whether a family member stands to benefit from that procurement. Be very, very useful to ensure that our software and services are being procured correctly and effectively. And the same could also apply for hardware as well. Then standardized procedures for workstation deployments could also be a very useful thing to ensure that a user's machine is deployed in a consistent, repeatable, and predictable way. This will guarantee that our end user system security will at the very least be consistent, preferably consistently secure. And also having standardized images would make this procedure even more effective and easier to implement. But another useful one, seeing as we're talking about users and stuff, is an enterprise patch or update process. Standardizing this will be very useful to ensure that whenever we're pushing out updates or patches to our systems, that it's done so in a way that benefits and improves the environment and does not jeopardize our ordinary operations. We could also look at considering how we're going to define our after-hours support and what procedures should be followed for that. This is very useful, as a common social engineering tactic is to try and impersonate a legitimate user seeking after-hours support, hoping that people are not going to be as attentive and likely to follow policy and procedure to get our way through that policy and procedure if we were attackers. So by defining a proper procedure for after-hours support, very, very useful. This is obviously wherever it's applicable. If you have a 24-hour call center or a time zone shifting call center, basically call centers around the world, so that no matter what time of the day, it's work hours somewhere, could be very, very useful. And speaking of, let's have some standardized procedures for a support ticket management system, where anytime problems arise, we've got standardized procedures for how does the ticket get generated, how does somebody get dispatched to it, how's the troubleshooting performed, how's the wrap-up process of the troubleshooting done, and also, most importantly, let's make sure there's some definitions for escalation, as the junior support technicians are not expected to solve every problem, but they should know when they need to escalate to maybe the network administrators, maybe the security team, or maybe flag this thing as a potential security incident for the incident response team to review and investigate. This will be very, very helpful. What'll be even more helpful for us, though, is to check out our standards. The reason being, our standards can oftentimes be a fantastic foundation for the development of our procedures, our policies, our guidelines, and so forth. Now, standards are meant to be a defined set of practices that give us specific details about what needs to be done. We often get these standards from regulations and policies that apply to our organization, but please be aware that the standard can change while the policy remains the same. So when standards change, which is very possible when it comes to standards that are sourced from outside the organization, you can have a situation where the policy will remain the same, because all the policy would have to say is that you remain compliant with this particular industry standard. Okay? But just because the policy remains the same doesn't mean the procedures and the guidelines do. They're probably going to have to update with the standards, as they are going to be the ones dictating what needs to be updated and improved. For instance, a standard might require that an organization do vulnerability management cycles where you scan for, detect, and remediate vulnerabilities. And the standard might update to require more regular, frequent vulnerability management cycles. The policy doesn't need to be changed, but the process and the guidelines do, to ensure that it is happening regularly enough. Normally what helps a lot here, though, is we'll have people that are subject matter experts when it comes to standards. They will be, for instance, ISO 27000 certified and stuff like that. And they will keep up to date with the standards and help make the improvements to the guidelines and the procedures wherever necessary, and even maybe updating the policies as needed. Please be aware though, these standards are not gospel truth. They set out a set of requirements and give direction on how to achieve them. But ultimately, they do need to be adjusted to fit the organization, as no two organizations are identical, but standards do help to guarantee that certain minimum expectations are being met when it comes to operations and security. Now, as I've already implied, there are going to be some external or industry standards that you might want to abide by. For example, you've got the ISO 27000 series I mentioned previously, the NIST 800 series of special publications for cybersecurity, and a whole bunch of other ones. But just because you are using external standards doesn't mean you couldn't look at developing some internal standards for yourself, where you follow self-determined requirements and best practices. What I normally like to do is treat the external standard requirements, like for instance ISO 27000 series for cybersecurity, as a bare minimum effort, because ultimately that's all being compliant with that external standard proves. I can follow ISO 27001, for instance, get certified as an organization, but that doesn't prove I'm doing an excellent job with cybersecurity. It just proves I'm doing at least that much to be recognized by the ISO as compliant with the standard and deserving certification. I'm a big believer in our internal standards should be stricter and higher than any external standards imposed upon us. But obviously, before we get all ambitious like my ideas are, it would be a good idea to ensure we're compliant with external standards first and then start chasing down better security than what's expected of us. Now, when it comes to things like standards being required, we're now entering the realm of legalities. This is normally when our policies and our guidelines, our internal standards and our procedures are meant to help an organization remain legally compliant with any obligations it may have, whether that be to a government or an industry regulation or anything like that. Now, when it comes to legal environments we need to consider, there are a few interesting aspects that need to be kept in mind. There are going to be international laws and requirements for various organizations depending on the industry in which they operate. Even if you do not have international operations or you do not have operations in another country, you might have, for instance with GDPR, an EU citizen's data in your database, in which case you are now subject to GDPR for at least that one person's data records and privacy requirements, possibly even more than just that person. Which is one of the reasons why you've probably noticed a lot of websites do that cookie policy where it intentionally and explicitly asks you to agree to the cookie policy before allowing you to carry on. It's part of GDPR's requirements, and even if the business isn't based there and has no intention to operate there, they might have customers coming from the European Union. Then you'll have national or federal law, depending on the country you're in. National or federal law is basically any legislation that applies across the country, regardless of how the country is divvied up into smaller portions. These laws apply across the land. Then in some cases you might have state or local law, if applicable. Not all countries in the world have a distinction between national and state or local legislation. Some countries just have a standardized national law that applies across the board. So that's why I say if applicable. Then there might be industry regulations that are imposed, especially on certain kinds of industries where health and safety are very, very important to adhere to. And by extension, because everything's being computerized now, the health and safety requirements will be even more likely to be enforced from a digital aspect. And then there is privacy legislation, as already mentioned, with GDPR. Kind of killed two birds with one stone. My bad. Now, let's have a look at some legal environments and some examples of legislation that you might need to be mindful of. Please be aware, you are not expected to become a legal expert as well, but these legislative requirements are not written in such a way that it is impossible for us to understand. Besides which, any reasonably sized organization should always seek legal counsel and get them to help develop policy and procedures to ensure legal compliance. So first up, let's tackle that privacy regulation. You've got the General Data Protection Regulation from Europe, which is considered one of the strictest privacy regulations in the world, but is very, very good in terms of ensuring minimal data transfer between a business and partners without the customer's consent, and does do a lot to decrease the risk of our customer data being compromised, as we are expected to keep it in a very secure fashion. You can go and check it out in your own time if you want to worry about the compliance. For both CompTIA and LPR with their Security Plus and Security Essentials exams, they just want you to be vaguely aware of what is GDPR. But if you're in North America, especially the USA, the CCPA or the California Consumer Privacy Act might come into the equation. But here's the fun fact. Many countries will have their own privacy legislation nowadays. Not all, but most do. And the level of strictness and expectations obviously varies across the board. Then, if you and your organization are involved in energy production, if you're in North America, you might have to worry about the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, who focus primarily on reliability, security, and stability of electrical generation. This is not bad, especially considering where you might have countries that have nuclear power. It could be very, very useful to ensure that there are reliability and security regulations imposed there. Then, a lot of countries are getting quite impressively involved with online children protection, making sure that children are safe, or at least not exposed to things on the internet that they shouldn't be exposed to. So we have SIPA, or the Children's Internet Protection Act. We've got COPA, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, both of which are very well worded and defined for how children should be protected online. However, the exact implementation might not always work out very well, because websites can be hosted in countries where those two legislative requirements don't exist. And that can still lead to some dodgy things. Also, these acts define up to what age is the child defined. And in some of these cases, it's kind of scary that the age might only be up to like 12 or 13 years of age. And I get very concerned, because then we're not protecting teenagers from harmful online content. Now, don't get me wrong, teenagers are young adults, and I appreciate that. But especially your younger teenagers around the age of between 14 and 16. If they're not in a very good mental health space at the time of those years, there can be some very harmful content online that they could get exposed to. So it's quite tricky. Freedom of information versus protecting people from themselves and from that information. Not a fun idea. And there's no perfect solution there. In fact, with a lot of these things, there's no perfect solution. Then you might have to worry about healthcare data as well. Now, in the USA, you've got the HIPAA, or the Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Now, when it comes to this legislation, it is going to dictate the requirements of security, privacy protection, and notification of security breaches around an individual's healthcare information. For those outside of America, please be aware that in some countries you actually have healthcare information being considered part of privacy. So something like GDPR would address healthcare information, as well as something like your full address and where you live and all that kind of stuff. Then we're going to have financial legislation environments as well, with things like the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which is normally applied to stock exchange listed companies, especially in North America. Or you might have a very financial industry specific regulation such as PCI DSS, or the payment card industry's data security standards, which are imposed upon any merchant bank that is going to facilitate credit card and debit card transactions for MasterCard, Visa, Diners Club, American Express, and so forth. So they will be expected to follow PCI DSS for minimizing the chances of online fraud, financial mismanagement, and stuff like that. You also will get some governmental regulations that might be imposed on certain organizations depending on the industry of operations, such as FISMA being applied to businesses that might engage with the federal government in the US. FISMA, or the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, requires certain things to be done to ensure modern, up-to-date security technologies are being used and always being done in a correct, secure, stable fashion. You also will have things for people to do forensic investigations, such as CGIS, the Criminal Justice Information Security Policy. And in the UK, you get things like the Government Security Classifications requirements. That'll dictate what an organization needs to worry about when it comes to governmental and security compliance. Now, with the risk of non-compliance and the organization getting fines and possibly even people getting arrested and experiencing jail time for transgressions on these, we need to worry about our governance and accountability. Now, legal governance within an organization is meant to ensure that the organization is abiding by any particular laws, especially cyber laws. Please be aware that in a lot of countries, ignorance to the law is not a valid defense against it. So as an organization saying, oh, we didn't know this law existed or we didn't know it applied to us, is not going to cut it. You need to worry about your legal governance, which is why once an organization reaches a critical size, you do need to worry about legal counsel, whether it be a full-time employee or a legal firm that you have on a consultation or retainer basis would be a very advisable idea. I remember once hearing somebody tell me that paying for legal advice is a lot cheaper than paying for legal repercussions. So do with that advice as you will. But we also might consider implementing some internal governance as well that will ensure policy and best practice support is being done compliantly, which normally helps with our legal compliance and our legal governance. So when we're looking at doing internal governance, there's an important thing to understand. You need to treat different groups of people as separate entities within the organization for internal governance to work well. You need to treat people that implement stuff as part of operations. So for instance, IT support, network administrators, even the security team responsible for deploying and improving cybersecurity fall under this group. Then we have the organization's management or executive grouping, where it's normally mid to senior leadership. And then finally, we need a governance department, IT governance, cybersecurity governance, etc. But when it comes to internal governance, it needs to be a separate logical entity within the organization so that it is not likely to become a part of office politics. If we make governance part of operations, then it's a governance operations versus management situation. And the same is true if we make governance part of management or the executive. Governance needs to be a separate entity to hold both to account and make sure that both parties are being reasonable with each other as regards to requests and expectations, so that they all work together smoothly. The best way to think about it is management and operations work together to create the solution, and governance is overseeing both of them to ensure they're doing what's meant to be done. Now, you could either centralize your governance or decentralize it. Centralizing means that all governance will be handled by one department or team. This means legal, regulatory, security, operations, etc. will all be centralized. Decentralized is where you'll break it up. So for instance, you might have security governance where we worry about ensuring security policy compliance internally, and then legal governance worrying about the external policy requirements being directed and implemented correctly. There's no right or wrong approach to governance, because the whole idea is it develops accountability. Governance is meant to make sure that people that are meant to do something, organizations that are meant to do something, are doing that thing. Because with no accountability and no repercussions, there's no point in having laws, policies, and regulations imposed upon either staff members, employees, users, or even entire organizations operating within a given sector. Now, a very important thing we want to do, besides all these fun documents that need to be developed, is we also need to have a look at doing good change control or change management. So, with change management processes or change control, depending on the terminology preferred, this is one of the frustrating things in IT, especially in larger organizations, that you have to go through a very extensive but very beneficial process to get things done. So first of all, the idea is it's going to give us controlled and systematic approaches to changes within the organization. Now, let's quickly define a change and then we can talk a bit more about it. So a change is meant to be any alteration that can affect the delivery of a product or a service in a significant way. This can be including things like adding something to your environment, a significant update, replacing something, upgrading something, migrating, retiring something, etc. Anything that will basically have a major impact on how a system or a service works gets considered as a change. And the idea is we're going to be going through a process where we make a proposal that argues for the change and is carefully planned out and tested before the change actually gets committed. This is one of the reasons why organizations of a certain size and nature tend to do improvements and alterations to their IT environments in a very slow way, but in a way that does maximize stability and reliability. So the idea is meant to help us minimize on the risks associated with a change and maximize the benefits of that change. So what gets involved with change management? Well, first of all, you're going to be getting stakeholder input. You're going to be asking the various stakeholders or representatives of stakeholders what they think about a proposed change or what they need from a change. Then we'll be conducting impact analysis to work out how will this change affect the operations, both positive and negative. We want to also try and test that change if we can and review the results. As with all tests, we will always acknowledge that a test is indicative but not 100% accurate to the real world, as there is always going to be that chance that we overlooked something or didn't consider something. I like to consider it Murphy's Law coming and affecting you. The one thing you overlook is the thing that'll mess with you. That's why testing helps us to try and eliminate as many things as possible that we could overlook. We'd also want to make sure that our change management contains a good rollout plan so that when we're making a proposal, we can say this is how we intend for the change to be implemented, both from a technical level and also from a stakeholder level of which stakeholders will be affected. But to me, probably one of the most useful things that we could get right in change management, especially when we're doing a proposal for a change, is a back-out strategy, or strategies preferably. What are you going to do if the change is not going to work? What happens if, for whatever reason, the tests didn't help and the change is going to fail? What are we going to do to go back to the way things were before so that we can say, well, we didn't get the change committed, but at least the systems and services are operating as they were before. To me, this is crucial to get right. And having a couple plans will always be useful, because plan A for a back out might not work. Plan B might work or it might not, so we'd like to have a plan C. I would probably stop there though, because having all the letters of the alphabet for our plans might get a little bit overwhelming and bog us down in unnecessary paperwork. Another thing we need to do as well is decide when we're going to do change and maintenance. Are we going to do this during a scheduled maintenance window, or are we going to schedule a change management window outside of scheduled maintenance? For instance, maybe Sunday evenings are scheduled maintenance period, but we want to get this change committed before the next scheduled maintenance, so maybe we do it on a Friday evening. That would be a scheduled change versus using a maintenance window. Both are viable options, but obviously the nature of the change will affect which one would be viable in that given situation. And all of this gets fed into a change proposal document where we will say, hey, this is what we would like to do. Now, other things can also be included as well, and often will be dependent on the change framework or the change management framework that is being followed. There are a variety of them. Now, the change proposal gets reviewed by the change review board or the change approval board, whatever term they prefer being called by. And it'll be a group of stakeholders, normally quite senior, that will say, yes, this change can go ahead, or no, this change is not justified. The risks outweigh the benefits. Now, in planning for a change, one of the most important things we can do as technical practitioners is worry about dependencies, service restarts, and potential downtime, as our system and service dependencies can get quite complicated and thus complicate the change, as we might have to do some restarts and resets that might affect other systems and services that depend upon what we are currently changing. This can drastically delay a restoration time and maybe cause us to not be able to commit the change during our change management window. Whether this will dictate the necessity of a backout strategy being implemented, that will all depend on timing and which would be quicker. Let the change complete or do a backout strategy that takes us outside of the change management window. We also might have some disruptions taking place if we do not properly anticipate the dependencies of a given system or service. One of the reasons why testing and review are so important. Downtime will also possibly occur during a change, and that downtime might not be sufficient for the change to take place. So we do need to consider that. So we want to work out how will we keep stakeholders informed, when would we notify them, and can we possibly get them to give us more time to complete the change, especially if we scheduled it at a time that would have minimal impact. This is one of the reasons why I keep talking about after hours, because a very common approach to change scheduling is to do it when the systems are under the least demand. Then, when we have legacy systems, which for all organizations is inevitable, you will have a legacy device or a system at some point, we do need to consider that the criticality is what's keeping that legacy system in our environment. We might heavily depend on that legacy technology for our operations. And if that is the case, then we need to maybe consider some extra testing to ensure compatibility issues will be overcome. And as this is a legacy system that's no longer receiving official updates, we must make extra considerations for every change helping to maintain or improve security. Now, another massively important and often overlooked thing is good change documentation. Honestly, good documentation can do a lot of good for cybersecurity in general, but let's talk about the change documentation specifically here. So first of all, we need to plan it out thoroughly and make sure that we are including in our proposals and our plans a motivation for the change. Why are we doing this? We shouldn't be implementing things for the sake of implementing things. There is a saying in enterprise IT support and system support: if it doesn't itch, don't scratch it. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do things for security. What it means is we're not going to go and implement a new application or a new service just because, oh, look how cool it is. Is there going to be a reason for it? Is there going to be a benefit for it? That's what we want out of this. And the details. As much detail as is necessary to convey the information needed to the next person. You won't always be working there. And I can guarantee you the next person will definitely appreciate the details of the change being very well documented. These details should include the risks of the change, of doing the change, and of not doing the change. In other words, leaving things as they are. Also, very thoroughly record and plan out the methodology, how you're going to do the change. That way, when it comes time to doing it, we follow our plan, and hopefully it should work, especially if our plan was tested well. It'll also help with any future reviews to figure out if that change caused a problem later on that might have only been detected weeks or months down the line. It'll help us figure out how that change could have caused that problem that only arose later on. And I know I keep banging on this drum, but trust me, a good backout plan or strategy is going to be absolutely beneficial. This will make a huge difference to the success of a change, or at the very least, the stability of a system when changes don't work out. Now, all of this should be added to or stored in any kind of configuration data store. Ideally, as an organization, you should have a configuration management database to keep track of how things are configured, and a change management database so that you can also keep track of how the changes have been implemented. Maybe even amalgamating the two together so that we can track how configuration and setup has evolved with the changes being done. Now, when you do this, one of the things that's very important to do is good version control of both change management documentation as well as configuration records. I also encourage that we should be doing some good date tracking as well to align the version numbering with a trackable date. My personal preference is that the year, month, and day become part of the version numbering, but that's not always doable. Maybe the organization prefers a version 3.2.8 style of versioning, and that's fine, but then definitely make sure that you track when did version 3. Whatever come out. Now, as I've already said, there are plenty of change management and change control frameworks out there. As an organization, if you are required to follow a particular one for maybe an industry regulation, so be it, you follow that. If you are not being forced to follow a particular framework, then go with whichever one's going to be the best fit. But always understand this. Change control and change management frameworks are just that. They're frameworks. They give you the skeleton of what needs to be done. As an organization, you get to put the flesh and skin on that skeleton. You get to tailor it and adjust it to suit your organization so that change control and change management becomes a beneficial activity, not an annoying compliance requirement. Then let's move on to automation and orchestration. Because yes, automation and orchestration are going to be wonderful things, but they must be very carefully planned and documented, as we are going to be letting stuff happen on its own. So let's talk about automation first. Automation can be achieved via scripting or using an automated platform's native utilities and commands. But before we run ahead and think, ooh, let's go crazy with automation, not everything has to be automated, nor should it be. What we should always be doing is determining whether automation is going to be beneficial or not. So we should ask ourselves some useful questions like, is this thing worth the human's time, or can a machine do it? To me, that is always my favorite question to ask about determining the benefit and necessity of automating something. Now, if we review some of the reasons and benefits, it'll also help us understand whether something should be automated or not. So let's look at some of the reasons for doing it and some of the benefits we get from it. First and foremost, we are going to cut down on the amount of human error, as automation will be a lot more consistent. We're not going to rely on somebody always being keyed in and in the zone and doing it right. We just need to have it done right once for the automation script. It also helps the human being by reducing the amount of mundane repetitive tasks we need to do. Nothing is more horrible than doing the same boring thing over and over again. What makes matters worse is when you expect a person to do a mundane repetitive task, their brain goes into autopilot mode and their conscious mind starts wandering. And that's when mistakes creep in, and those mistakes are often quite challenging to identify and isolate, and that is exactly the kind of mistake that the threat actors want us to be making. We'll also have consistency, as I've already said, because once we've got the script done right, we just keep running it over and over and over, and it'll keep doing the task the same way, over and over and over, if we did the automation well. Another nice thing as well is for the lengthy tasks, we're going to cut down on implementation time. One of the annoying, frustrating things I've always felt with a lot of operations and management is you'll start something off and you have to wait for a progress bar to complete before something can be done and then the next step taken. Now the problem is, when I have to sit there waiting for a progress bar to complete, I get bored. I'll either wander away and make myself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, or I will get busy with something else while I wait. And of course, at some point that progress bar finishes and now the system is waiting on me for some input to move on. Which means that until I notice that, it's taking longer for something to be implemented. So with automation, again, we can simplify our life because as soon as it's ready for the next input, the automation can provide it, and then the system can carry on with whatever task we were trying to do. And then one of my favorite reasons to automate something is to streamline a complex task. If there is a complex set of commands and options that need to be done to administrate something, if we can get that right once in an automated script, we just use that script time and time again so that that complex task gets done correctly and consistently. Now, those benefits and reasons in mind, that will help you figure out, yes, this thing might be worth automating, or no, it's not. But automation also comes hand in hand with orchestration. So let's figure out what is automation and what would orchestration be. So let's understand what we're automating and what we're orchestrating. So first up, a variety of tasks. We've got task 1, task 2, task 3, task 4. Those are individual activities that are being done to achieve a desired goal. That combination of tasks being performed is a workflow. Okay, cool. So a workflow is made up of tasks. Neat. Now here's the magical trick I've got for you guys. You automate your tasks and you orchestrate your workflows. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the nice thing about treating automation and orchestration like this is it means that you can use different things to automate each of those tasks. And as long as those different things that we use for the automation can all be orchestrated together, we're in a good position. We're in a good situation. We can have entire workflows being done autonomously for us. That sounds great. So let's talk a bit more about it though. So first of all, tasks are going to get automated to improve efficiency and the effectiveness of the work that the task is trying to achieve. Orchestration is meant to help us coordinate the automated tasks. What's quite nice about a good orchestration solution is that it'll work across disparate or different systems. Obviously, this will depend on the orchestration platform you decide to choose or go with, or whatever your organization might already be using. But one of the big things that I like about orchestration that my diagram previously did not show is that orchestration can use branching logic. In other words, orchestration can get to a point where it needs to decide, do I need to do this or do I need to do something else? It has to make a choice between option A and option B. And that branching logic can be part of the orchestration's operations where it checks the conditions and makes the appropriate choice, the same choice that a human would make. Or you could have a request that a human operator provides feedback to the orchestration platform before it's allowed to continue down a particular branch of logic. So we can have the orchestration platform saying, you know what, let's rather have a human being approve option A or option B. So again, very cool. Automation is not fully autonomous. Humans are still involved to some extent, such as keeping the stuff maintained and up to date. One of the big things that I hear a lot of people get worried about when they hear about automation and orchestration is they're worried about being automated out of a job. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say that isn't going to happen, but if you and your team set up an automated process or an entirely orchestrated workflow, that is fantastic. That is wonderful because you have now saved yourself time. That time can be spent on other tasks and activities, making you and your team more effective and more productive, which is wonderful. Now, it would be foolish for an organization to get rid of you because that automation and orchestration will not last forever. At some point, something changes on the system being orchestrated or automated that might cause the automation and orchestration to stop working. What's going to happen then? Well, either you address the issue, which would be the best, as you and your team probably know the automation and orchestration better than somebody else. The organization getting rid of you, and then they need someone to update and fix the automation and orchestration when it stops working. They either got to get you back or they got to get someone else, and that someone else has got to figure out everything that you've done. So it's bad business management and bad leadership to get rid of people that automate and orchestrate things. Besides which, we didn't say everything gets automated. My overall question is it worth a human doing it, or can a machine rather do it? That's always the deciding factor. And I promise you there is always going to be a need for the human operator somewhere in the organization. Now, let's have some considerations of implementing automation. First up, security automation. Security automation can be amazingly helpful when used in the correct ways, such as monitoring for security events and incidences especially, or triggering an initial response phase. I wouldn't say that we want to automate the entirety of incident response, but maybe the detection, the analysis, and possibly some initial containment would be a very, very good idea. And that will drastically decrease the amount of time required to contain a threat. This means that an attacker has less time to get away with stuff. If we relied on a human being for the entirety of incident response, we are relying on human beings' reaction times and also analytics times. We can only detect, respond to, analyze, and decide what to do so quickly. A machine can do it way quicker than us. But consider a few things before you jump into the idea of automating a lot of things in security. How complex is it going to be to implement this automation? Yes, automation can be complex, but if it's exponentially more complicated to automate something than it is to do it manually, it might not be worth the while. Also, how costly is it going to be? Some automated solutions are going to cost you little to nothing. For instance, using shell scripting and the cron tab in Linux is only going to cost you time. But that doesn't help a lot with orchestration. And in a mixed environment where you've got Linux and Windows and Mac OS and so forth, you might need a cross-platform automation and orchestration solution, which means you might have to pay for a licensed solution. Also, if you're not careful, your automation can become a single point of failure. One of the pieces of advice I always like to give, especially in some of the courses like with Linux and shell scripting, is make sure you still understand how your commands work. Make sure that you can still do the stuff manually if your script is not available to you. Because if you become dependent on your automation and orchestration and that thing goes wrong or it gets compromised, it becomes a single point of failure. Another thing we also need to be mindful of is technical debt. A lot of people refer to scripting and automation as programming. And in a way, it can be true because we do use some programming conventions. But in fairness to programmers and software developers alike, we are not writing raw lines of source code and turning it into an application. We're normally taking commands and applications that already exist, have already been developed, have already been programmed, and orchestrating them. We're basically programming the programs. But because we follow similar principles, we use similar utilities and conventions like if statements and for loops and stuff like that, we're going to be making decisions on our automation that'll work right now, but might cause problems in the long term, especially when it comes to updating the scripts and the automation and the orchestration, expanding on their capabilities, adjusting to changes in technology. We might run into big problems that might require us to basically throw everything out and start again. That's technical debt for you. Technical debt is some point we have to pay for the decisions being made. We have to review stuff, we have to fix issues, we have to maintain, we have to implement changes that are not going to necessarily give the organization any major benefits, but will improve the sustainability and viability of any developed solution that we have. Also, as I've said already, automation is not bulletproof. We need to be prepared for additional support. We already have to worry about supporting existing systems and services. And then when you add automation and orchestration to the equation, things can go wrong with an orchestration platform. Automation can do stuff that we didn't expect it to do, because remember, computers follow instructions, not intentions. And if we didn't thoroughly test our automation and orchestration before deploying, that can create some horrible problems that we need to deal with. So we are going to actually be increasing support burden. But as long as we acknowledge these considerations and work carefully with them, automation and orchestration, especially in security, can be massively advantageous. What's also advantageous is that is all I need to cover with you guys in this section. It's not the most exciting thing, as I said at the beginning of this video, but documentation and policies and procedures and stuff like that is a part of cybersecurity. It's the less glamorous part. And you'd be surprised you spend a lot of your time doing boring things in cybersecurity. But nonetheless though, that was the video. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like. If you've got any friends or family members or colleagues that would benefit from this, don't be afraid to share it with them. But most importantly, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.